you know, it seems to me that we have these studies, and I'm getting some curious information here today that there are some studies that seem to indicate to me, Dr. Sadetsky and Dr. Lasinski, there's some studies that indicate that there are findings that show that some people who have been exposed for long periods of time do in fact have higher levels of certain kinds of brain or head cancers. Is that a fair statement I just made? That there are studies that show that people who have had longer term usage of cell phones compared to another group have higher incidences of either brain or head type of cancers? No? Yes? Yes, Dr. Sadetsky. I was trying to find that.
Yes, I think that this statement is correct. I think that when you look at the data, you see indeed that in the first 10 years nothing happens.
Right.
However, when you look at all the individual studies that are out there, you do see something after 10 years with ipsilateral use, meaning, as you said before, holding the phone at the same side where the tumor occurred. And our study also showed increased risk for people who are in the high category of use. However, what we need to understand is that there are standards for research. These studies are based on very few users because very few users have been using the phone for more than 10 years. Therefore, you know, I have two hats, public health as a public health practitioner and as a researcher. Now, obviously, for research, these observations are not enough. There is a discussion whether these observations are true or whether they are stem from methodological problems. So as a researcher, I do say we have a hint that something is going on, however, we need more research. But as a public health practitioner, I'm saying, wait a minute, this is a red light and we must do something. And especially since this something is very easy to implement, because all we need to do is to put the cell phones away from our body.
Dr. Davis, you said in your testimony, again, following up on this, is that you said you cite Dr. Sadetsky study, and you say that Interphone has studied people who use phones heavily for a decade, has found that where persons have used phones heavily for a decade or longer, there is evidence of significantly increased risk, literally a doubled risk of malignant brain tumors. Is that correct interpretation?
I cannot comment on the overall Interphone results because the overall Interphone results are now under review. They are not published yet. What is true, I mean, what you said is correct when you look at individual studies published from the Interphone results, not the overall results.
But again, those are based on?
Those are based on people who are long-term users. The term long-term users is also not very correct because we're talking about people who talked for more than 10 years.
Then, Dr. Davis, you said that the one researcher to have studied young people who began using cell phones as teenagers, Professor Leonard Hardell of Sweden, has found that those who started to use cell phones heavily before age 20 have 4 to 6 times more brain tumors by the time they reach their 30s. Can we get some documentation on that study?
Absolutely. In fact, tomorrow at our international conference that's being held just a few blocks away, I invite your staff to attend. At 8 o'clock in the morning, Leonard Hardell will be speaking to us by Skype from Sweden, where he will present not only that result, but additional analyses of unfortunately, of new cases. You have to understand that in the Scandinavian countries and in Israel, they have been using cell phones a lot longer and a lot more heavily than we have. So unfortunately, they have some of those data. I should also add that one of the most troubling findings is a series of studies that have been produced in the United States. This is one study that was done opportunistically at a fertility clinic, and in Hungary and other countries, finding reduced sperm count in young men who keep their phones in their pockets, which unfortunately many young men do, even though if you read the advice that's on the iPhone and the BlackBerry, it says keep the phone 1 inch away from your body. actually 0.98 inches in case you want to be precise. But the reality is very few people do that. And lots of young men keep their phones in their pockets, particularly in the summertime. And the Cleveland Clinic published a peer-reviewed study showing reduced sperm count, and that was not the only such study, but only the most recent one.
Let me ask the question I asked Dr. Bucher. Okay, I've got my BlackBerry, which we use all the time. Again, just individual, I'll go down the line, Dr. Lisinski, and on down the line. If you were to use a BlackBerry like I do and you were calling people, if you had the option of putting it up to your ear like this and talking, or you could use a earphone like this with a little speaker down here, which would you do?
I personally, and also my institution, is advising to use earpiece instead of keeping cell phone to your head.
So
it is very simple way, very cheap way to reduce exposure of head to cell phone radiation. So I would use earpiece.
Dr. Sadetsky, any difference?
Same thing.
Dr. Erdrich?
I recognize that use of an earphone would decrease a person's exposure to RF. I don't think, I really can't agree that it reduces the risk, because I don't think the total picture of all the studies taken together with all their complications, I don't think this assessment suggests that there is a risk from using the cell phone.
Dr. Davis?
I brought my earpiece when you were talking, but I want to go on to read what the FDA and FCC site say, since Dr. Erdrich suggested to the contrary. The site, as of yesterday, says, the scientific evidence does not show a danger to any users of cell phones from RF exposure, comma, including children and teenagers, period. The steps adults can take to reduce RF exposure apply to children and teenagers as well. Bullet, reduce the amount of time spent on the cell phone. Bullet, use speaker mode or a headset to place more distance between the head and the cell phone. I'm continuing to read from their site. Some groups, sponsored by other national governments, have advised that children be discouraged from using cell phones at all. And then it goes on to say, for example, in 2000, in the UK, the Stewart Report advised this. And their recommendation to limit cell phone use by children was strictly precautionary. It was not based on scientific evidence that any health hazard exists. Close quote from the FDA website. It's in my testimony submitted for the record. The question we have to ask is, what is evidence? Do we insist that the only evidence we will accept is when we have enough sick or dead children? I hope that that's not the case, and that we've made some progress as a society in order to take the kinds of precautions that our colleagues in Israel and Finland and many other nations are taking today. And I especially want to thank my colleague, Dr. David Servan-Schreiber, who is himself a scientist, a physician, a researcher, and a brain tumor survivor. So his interest in this issue is quite intense and personal.
Thank you, Dr. Nedenko. Dr. Nedenko, the same question. Which would you do?
Thank you for this question, Senator. Based on our very extensive science review, EWG strongly recommends the use of a headset such as the ones that you hold in your hand, and I think I have a very similar one.
Any difference between this and Bluetooth?
The Bluetooth is, of course, itself emitting radio frequency radiation. So when a cell phone is here, on the table next to me, the Bluetooth will be transmitted from the ear to the cell phone. The distance is shorter, so the amount of radiation Bluetooth would put out would be smaller than a cell phone would put out to a tower way out there. Based on our science review, we found that experts are split. Of course, our distinguished colleagues in Israel are recommending a wired earpiece, such as the one that you have. Our colleagues in Switzerland do feel that Bluetooth is a good choice. And then we have reviewed government websites from many European countries. We have found that some recommend both, some recommend just wired, and we at WG feel that either headset would be better than holding the phone to the ear.
My 7 minutes are up, but any on Bluetooth? Dr. Davis, we'll go back down this way then.
Yes, in fact, if you are using a Bluetooth and you have the phone away from your body and you turn it off when you're not using it, it does give you much less exposure. But the problem is that most people who use a Bluetooth have the phone on their hip right at their bone marrow, and have it on all the time. And that is what we are concerned about.
Dr. Erdrich? Any difference between this and Bluetooth?
No comment on
No
Bluetooth.
comment? Dr. Sadetsky?
Yes, there are. Usually it's true that the Bluetooth is better than the cell phone itself, but there are situations in which the Bluetooth involves higher emission than the cell phone itself, such as when the reception is really good. So because the Bluetooth is always constant exposure, while the cell phone adapts with the base station all the time. Besides, we in Israel were worried that when people wear this Bluetooth, it is so comfortable, it becomes part of your body, that they will just talk more and more, and therefore the overall exposure will be higher.
Interesting. And Dr. Zasensky?
Yes, of course, Bluetooth is very comfortable because you don't have those wires all the time hanging. However, Bluetooth is emitting radiation continuously, and we don't have slightest idea what this kind of continuous exposure of area of ear can achieve in due time. Therefore, it is much better to use this earpiece. On the other hand, also it's necessary to remember that, as Dr. Davis mentioned, when people have Bluetooth in their ear, they usually keep cell phone somewhere else in a pocket, and then this area next to cell phone is being exposed. If it is breast pocket or pocket in trousers, different areas will be then exposed. Not our head, but somewhere else this radiation goes.
Dr. Davis, what is the strongest evidence you know about an alleged causal connection between use of the cell phone and a brain tumor?
Well, the strongest evidence does not come from human studies, and that's the problem. When we're looking at public health information, we have to rely on experimental evidence such as that developed by the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences in this country and researchers in Europe, in the REFLEX project and others. If we look at experimental studies, we have very strong evidence. If we look at human studies, as Dr. Erdreich has commented...
Tell us about the experimental study.
Well, as a matter of fact, here we go. This is a model of the brain, and while the precise information in here has been debated, this is approximately the absorption that gets into the head of a 5-year-old, and this is about the absorption here on the blue line that gets into the head of an adult.
Well, that establishes there's more absorption for a
Right.
Wait a minute. Just answer the question. That establishes more absorption from a 5-year-old, but that's not my question. My question is, what is the strongest evidence you have that exposure to a cell phone causes cancer?
All right. The process of cancer arises from many different insults to our DNA, the basic building blocks of our genetic material inside our cells. Researchers have shown that radio frequency signals at exactly the same wavelength as those of the new phones can cause heat shock proteins. Those are proteins that the body forms in response to stress, and those have been shown in cancer research.
Wait a minute. We don't have time for a treatise. We have 5 minutes.
Okay. I think I can do it in 5 or less.
No, just answer my question. What is the strongest evidence you have that exposure to a cell phone causes cancer?
The work that's been done on the COMET assay that shows double-strand breaks in DNA after exposure to cell phone radiation is very strong evidence experimentally. If we tie that with the human studies of Dr. Sadetsky and others that have looked at people who have 10 years of exposure or more, we put that together and we have strong evidence.
Well, Dr. Sadetsky has testified that you see something after 10 years, but she says that there are so few involved that she can't draw a scientific conclusion. Is that an accurate statement, Dr. Sadetsky?
Regarding the 10 years, yes. But first of all, I would like to say that I'm not sure that there is an association. I cannot be sure based on the current epidemiological data. But what worried me was that in my study I saw consistent positive results, and they always appeared where there is biological plausibility. They did not appear in this group or in that group. They appeared in the more than 10 years. They appeared on the same side where the phone was held. They appeared for the heavy users, and they appeared in rural areas compared to urban areas, and this also has biological plausibility because where antenna is more dense, then the exposure is lower. So the fact that all of these indications appeared where they should have appeared told me that it was a really red light. But as a scientist, this is not enough, definitely not for causality. But it's indication that, according to my judgment, is enough in order to advise the precautionary principle.
As a scientist, it's not enough to conclude a causal connection. Is that right?
Right. For causal association, the criteria are much more stricter.
Dr. Erdreich, you testified that the evidence does not demonstrate a connection between cell phone and cancer. Now, it is much harder to prove a negative, but what would your answer be? Does the evidence demonstrate that there is no connection between a cell phone and cancer?
You've made an important observation. I think the evidence...
I haven't made an observation. Yes. I've asked a question.
All right.
I'm not having much luck with answers, but that's my question.
I think the strongest evidence is not any single study. The strongest evidence is that there is a body of research where we've looked at whether certain studies that showed anything can be replicated, whether we've looked at consistency across studies, and where there have been more than 40 animal studies that use different measures to assess the long-term risks. The evidence doesn't come from any single study. The evidence comes from a careful review, looking at the strengths and weaknesses together and putting the data together. This is supported by the fact that the Interphone studies, as Dr. Sadetsky states, taken together are kind of strongly not showing an association between use and cancer. So the answer I have to be
not strongly suggest a showing between the use and cancer.
It doesn't show.
But that's not a demonstration that there is no connection.
Exactly. What's important is that in the background context of what we know about the nature of the signal, the strength of the signal, how it interacts with cells. There's been research going on with this for over 50 years, although the research in the last 20 years is, of course, used improved methods and is more definitive.
I was once involved in a hearing which had a similar question. The question was, is there evidence that there was no conspiracy on the assassination of President Kennedy? You don't see the connection. The proof of a negative is very, very different from the proof of a positive.
Exactly.
And when you boil it all down, what I hear is not a whole lot of disagreement in this panel. You, Dr. Erdreich, say that there is so little question, in fact, there's no issue of risk at all that you wouldn't take any precaution. I find that... No, wait a minute, I'm not finished. When I finish, I give you a question, I'll pause. But where you end up with all the verbiage, you do not say that the evidence demonstrates there is no connection. Isn't that a fair statement of your testimony?
It is part of that is a fair statement.
Well, which part isn't?
The part that I said there's absolutely no risk whatsoever.
That wasn't part of my question. That was an observation before.
Your statement that it's very hard to prove a negative is really on target.
Let's come back to my question. Isn't the fair summary of your testimony that there is the evidence does not demonstrate the absence of any connection between exposure and cancer?
the evidence does not, excuse me, I have to take just the liberty of rephrasing.
No, I'll do that.
Oh, please.
The evidence does not demonstrate that there is no connection between the use of a cell phone and cancer.
You had said the evidence does not demonstrate that there's no connection. Is that what you meant to say? I'm sorry.
I'll repeat it again.
All right.
A fair statement of your testimony is that the evidence does not demonstrate that there is no connection between the use of a cell phone and cancer.
The scientific evidence could never demonstrate a total no connection.
And I take your answer to be correct. Well, let me tell you where I come out, because this hearing has run very long, but it's been, I think, very worthwhile. What comes through to me is that we just don't know what the answer is. Dr. Sadetsky raises a lot of red flags, but she says, well, it's not whether we use cell phones, but how we use them. She's not advocating not using cell phones. And Dr. Davis, who drew almost as much applause as Senator Harkin, made the comment that she's not alarmed, but she's concerned. And the issue of the precautions, I think, comes through to me, with the exception of Dr. Erdreich's testimony, that precautions are worth taking. Certainly more worth taking than the precautions I undertake in not eating sugar or white flour out of concern for feeding into cancer, and that precautions are not a bad idea. They may not be a good idea, but they're not a bad idea. And that the issue of children is something we ought to look at a little more closely because of the sensitivity of that issue. We have a duty to do more by protecting children. The question that I think boils down to what additional studies are necessary, because nobody knows. And a question as to whether the people who sell cell phones ought to be undertaking more studies. That's a harder question. What Senator Harkin and I can have some influence on is the appropriations process, and to some extent suggestions as to what ought to be done. Whether there's enough of a risk here to prompt the telephone companies, to people who provide cell phones, whoever does that is another question, and my recommendation would be that they study the testimony here very carefully, and that more is to follow. And one final question, Dr. Davis. Does your invitation to appear at your hearing at 8 a.m. tomorrow morning to hear this fellow from overseas extend to everyone?
Absolutely. Well, we will have it available on the web, and people will have to come and register by 7:30 if they want to be in by 8. We have a... So
if it's on the web, we can sleep in?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Distinguished panel. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Spector. Let me follow up on another thing. First of all, I know that we don't have jurisdiction over the FDA here, or the FCC.
Now, when has that stopped you, Senator Harkin?
Huh? What did you say?
I said, when has that stopped you, Senator Harkin?
Well, you didn't hear my follow-up. But because of my new chairmanship on another committee, I do have jurisdiction at the FDA. But what I wanted to follow up with is a question that I will pursue beyond this panel with my friends at NIH, and that is this. Dr. Erdreich stated, and I made note of this because it's something that I have wondered about for a long time. He said that RF energy is not radiation in the same sense as used for high-frequency X-rays because the energy of RF is so much lower and is unable to change the DNA of cells. do you have any definitive proof that this RF energy is unable to change the DNA of cells? Now, Dr. Davis said a study by Professors Henry Lai and Singh showed that low levels of RF signals could produce strange defects in DNA in 1994. So I've got two different things here, and I said I will pursue this beyond this panel with NIH to see if we have any definitive answer to that. Is DNA harmed by low-level RF frequency? Did you have any further views on that, Dr. Erdrich? I can't hear you.
Thank you. This part of the spectrum is known as non-ionizing radiation because it is not known to cause those changes that we've talked about. There have been mentioned a study. It is not the only study, and the agencies that I've been involved with or that I've read about, that have reviewed the research, have considered all of the studies on this question, and they have not concluded that it's been proven to affect the DNA of cells. And the second part is that the strongest evidence you can get is from humans, but there's difficulties in epidemiology studies and in whole animals. Most agencies and authorities that do evaluate health risk think that these studies in cells are important, but it's quite a stretch to say that what happens in cells can happen in human beings or in animals.
But Dr. Sadetsky, you had a view on this, and Dr. Lasinski wants to weigh in on this. Yes.
I don't want to get into the discussion, do we have a mechanism or not, or do we first need to prove epidemiology and then mechanism, or the other way around. I just wanted to mention very briefly that ELF, extremely low frequency, which has even less energy, was determined by the IARC, the International Association for Cancer Research, as a possible carcinogen in 2006.
What kind of RF frequency? What?
ELF, extremely low.
What?
Oh, I'm sorry. The IARC is the association of it's a body of the WHO.
Yes.
Which classifies carcinogens, and they have different levels of carcinogens, starting from definite carcinogen, such as smoking or ionizing radiation, and ending by probably not a carcinogen. So extremely low frequency, which is also in the spectrum of low energy, was determined by this organization in June 2006 as possible carcinogen.
Possible.
Yeah.
Dr. Lasinski, did you have something you wanted to say about this?
Yes. We don't have precise knowledge whether DNA is damaged by mobile phone radiation. There can be two ways how mobile phone radiation could affect cells that we observe damaged DNA. Either it would be damaged by radiation itself, or radiation could interfere with process of repair of DNA in cells. In cells normally, all the time, DNA damage occurs spontaneously, and this radiation could either interfere with this process of repair, meaning those spontaneously damaged fragments of DNA would not be repaired, or it could damage DNA. However, as it was mentioned earlier, it doesn't have enough energy to damage directly DNA. However, there are indications from some studies that mobile phone radiation can induce production in cells of special molecules which are very chemically active, called free radicals, and those molecules could indirectly damage DNA. So we have those two options for mechanism. Right now, we don't know yet which one of them is correct one. And as was mentioned already earlier, human evidence is the most important, most valuable for us. We cannot get this information, for example, on DNA damage from epidemiological studies. However, this is what I was suggesting, this new direction in research, namely making molecular level experiments in human volunteers. This is possible. It's possible to expose, for example, small areas of skin of people to mobile phone radiation, take a sample of this skin and examine, for example, for DNA damage. We have done this kind of experiments. We were looking not on DNA, we were looking on behavior of proteins in human skin, but it is feasible, it is possible to do, and it is also permitted by ethical panels experimentation.
More? I just, if you have any more, I'll yield to you. I have a couple more, but if you have something else, I'll yield to you for any further questions. I just had a couple follow-up things. Go ahead. Okay. Dr. Naidenko, you and Dr. Sadetsky both had recommendations for cell phone use. I was trying to get through all of these. You recommended, Dr. Naidenko, holding the phone away from the body. We've already gone over the earpiece bit. Dr. Sadetsky, you said the same thing, a speaker phone or hands-free phone, keeping it away from the body. Dr. Davis, you said that a cell phone should not be kept any closer than an inch to your body. Is that what you said? I don't know where does that come from?
That actually comes from the BlackBerry manual as well as from the iPhone manual. If you read the manuals, which almost none of us does, that is what they say. So by calling for warning labels as I am simply calling to codify what the industry is currently telling us about cell phones. And I would also add that when I was privileged to work with Dr. Ronald Herbermann at the University of Pittsburgh Cancer Institute, he looked at the evidence on this issue as one of the world's most distinguished cancer biologists, and he concluded that it was appropriate to warn the staff to take these simple precautions, the same precautions that Israel is recommending, the same precautions that Finland, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden have recommended.
Okay, now let's face it, us men, now my wife has a BlackBerry, she keeps it in her purse. It's fine. Mm-hmm. We all have these holsters, right? Every man, we all have these. Put them on our belts. Mm-hmm. Are you telling me that I should not wear a BlackBerry?
Well, actually, the holster may give you enough distance. That's why BlackBerry says, I mean, an inch, take a look at it. An inch is, you know, you get some distance there. That's why they recommend that you use their holster. But the reality is we don't know. And as scientists, it really shouldn't be my job to tell you what's safe.
Well, that's not an inch. I don't have an inch between my holster.
You know, they recommend their holster. I guess this is a question that we ought to ask the appropriate government agencies and the private sector to resolve. And Dr. Servan Schreiber is working now with senior French officials in the government as well as in the telecom industry, because they are working in the telecom industry, in France at least, to make the kinds of changes which they think are appropriate. And I hope that this hearing will lead to a new day of cooperation, because we need the cooperation of industry to solve this problem. We really do.
Also, my last thing is that cell phone technology is changing almost every day.
Yeah.
Now, when I first started out a few years ago, I had a cell phone. Now you have BlackBerries. Now you do everything. They're computing devices. And so I don't know, I'm not an expert in this, but I assume that what I do with this and browse and do everything else emits more RF than what my old cell phone used to, which I just talk to people on. Is that true? No?
I don't think we know. In fact, not necessarily, because so long as you're holding it out here, you actually are going to get less exposure. This is what we're principally concerned about right now. And this is what we need the FDA and the FCC to look into very carefully, because the current standards are based on the standards for a 200-pound man with an 11-pound head talking for 6 minutes to avoid heat. Now, that's not relevant to my 3-year-old granddaughter who likes to play with a cell phone. And that's the problem we have. The current standards are set for a very large, big man, and not for me or many other people in the world today. In Brazil, for example, there are 120 cell phone users, and half of them are under age 20. Thank you. 120 million, thank you.
Well, the last thing I want to say, Dr. Naidenko, I don't have that list. Describe for me just a little bit the testing you went through. You tested 1,200 different phones?
Thank you, Senator. Just to clarify what we have done, we have conducted a science review of over 200 publications. These were peer-reviewed studies, government advisories, and industry documents, and that is in our cell phone radiation report. We have also compiled information on over 1,200 phones. We did not test the phones. We looked for that information in all publicly open sources. For many of the phones, we did succeed with a lot of effort to find the radiation output. For some phones, we did not. And the reason for that is that government does not require disclosure, and consumers have to go through very onerous and time-consuming task to find what their model may emit.
There's no government agency, the FCC does not put out this kind of information and about how much RF frequency is put out by the different phones? It's not, the FCC doesn't publish that?
Thank you, Senator. That's a very important point. So, FCC does maintain a database of documents associated with every phone model that would be identified by FCC ID. But to locate that information, the cell phone user has to know the FCC ID. So the steps are: buy the phone, find the FCC ID, go to FCC database. This is not available at the point of sale or in a readily available location.
Well, I want to see that list. I'll have my staff get it. I want to take a look at it, and we had to somehow get it published, or somebody had to at least know what the different ratings or something are. Okay, well, two last things. Senator Specter and I both have to leave, but to Dr. Davis.
You just need to know that the reported SAR, specific absorption rate, can be off by a factor of 2 to 4. There's no routine testing, there's no monitoring, there's no surveillance. The only time the FDA can act is if a hazard has been reported, as happened in the case of the LG flip phone in Canada last year, where 250,000 phones were recalled because they were found to be having a higher emission rate. So even though the SARs may be publicly available and the EWG is to be commended for compiling them, we have no guarantee that your specific phone is at that SAR or half that or double it.
Did you have something you wanted to add to that, Dr. Sadecki? I didn't know. I thought you were signaling me. Did you want to?
Just two minor points. The first is that in Israel it is obligatory by law to have the specific absorption rate on every phone that is in the market.
You're doing that now? Or?
Yes, already for 4 years now.
Oh.
The second thing, I don't think that an inch would be enough. I would like to see the phones a bit further from the body. And you asked how it will be done, and this is a very legitimate question. I think that if the companies will need to do it, they have such clever engineers that they will find a solution. It's a technical problem. I see it as a minor problem. I think it can be done very easily with few clever engineers sitting together in the room for half an hour.
All right. Senator Specter, I think you want to add before we...
Well, I have a final comment. See what the Senate can do on a Monday afternoon if a couple of senators are in town.